It's time for the Kim Hammer Show, where you'll learn how your state government affects you, your family, and community. Here's Kim Hammer.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Kim Hammer Show. Glad to have you listening on another beautiful Saturday. Hopefully you're out in your yard working, listening on your ear device there, and just enjoying a beautiful day. I want to begin by thanking the sponsors that help make this show possible. It'd be Edward Food Stores in Central Arkansas, also out on the east side of Arkansas as well. You can Google them and find them, and as I always tell you, they always provide great service, and they also have friendly stores. You can now have curbside pickup service, or you can call your order in ahead or email your order in ahead, order online, and have it waiting for you, and they'll bring it out to you. So they've got all the modern conveniences of the big box store. It's just that they have a lot more personal touch and personal care for their customers. So I encourage you to go by and support Edward Food Store. Then also want to give a shout out to Baxley Penfield Mowdy down there in Saline County. If you have any real estate needs, whether that be rental or commercial or residential, give them a call down there in Saline County, and they will be sure to take care of you. They give great quality service both before the sale and after the sale. And then Everett GMC Buick down there at Saline County on I-30 at Elko exit. Go in and see Dwight, Susie, or their sales staff. They've got a great service department down there at very competitive prices, and they will fix your car and take care of you right. Also, Duck's Garage down in Benton. Duck is down there on Air Lane Drive. You hear him on this radio station, 101.1 FM. The Answer, he comes on over with Joe's Garage pretty much on a weekly basis, and so if you need any of your cars worked on or your fleet of vehicles worked on, especially diesels, go down there and see Duck at Duck's Garage on Air Lane Drive there in Benton. Want to point out a couple things. One, if you're watching live on Facebook, we thank you for joining on. In a minute, when I introduce our guest for the day, Ben's going to come on and tell you how you can email in a question if you'd like to, or Facebook us a question. But you'll notice if you're watching on Facebook, we've got a poster up. The church I pastor, which is Saline Baptist Church, down in the community of Tull outside of Benton, about 5 miles. We are going to do a sportsman banquet a week from today. Doors will open at 5, and then the serving of the food will start at 6. We have Pat Fitz, who is the director of Game and Fish, that's going to be there, and they're going to bring some of their cool stuff, including the little crocodiles for the kids to be able to play. We'll have things for the kids that they're able to take advantage of starting at 5 o'clock. This is a family event. I encourage you to come down and participate, and it's a free event. We just want to express our appreciation to the community and give them opportunity to just come experience Saline Baptist Church down in Tull. All right, with that being said, we have two guests on today. The first is Dr. Terry Parrish, who is pastor of Spring Creek Baptist Church down in Benton, but also is the president of the American Baptist Association. We're going to talk about the subject of separation of church and state, and then we'll be joined in the second half of the hour by Dr. Jennifer Dillaha, who is with the Department of Health, and we're going to talk about the coronavirus and also talk about the flu. So you'll get some good factual information, not the hype-up stuff that you see floating around on Facebook and some other social media outlets. We're going to hear it straight from the source in the second half of the hour. As we did last week, we're going to do today. We will not take a news break at the bottom of the hour. We're just going to transition from Dr. Parrish over to Dr. Dillaha so we can make the most of the hour. And if you've got a question that you want to send in, Ben, tell them how they can send in a question on Facebook there, if you would.
Okay, on Facebook, either the Kim Hammer Show Facebook page or Kim David Hammer's Facebook page under the video comment section. If you like a question, you just comment in there, and I'll get to the guest and Senator Hammer, or email the show's email at kimhammershow@gmail.com.
And you can always call into 501-823-0965, 501-823-0965. All right, Dr. Parrish, I'm used to calling you Terry, so you may get called Terry, but out of respect, Dr. Parrish, why don't you just introduce yourself for the guests a little bit, tell them a little bit about your history.
Yes, my name's Terry Parrish. I was born in Clay County, Arkansas, and I've been in Central Arkansas since the early 70s. I am pastor of the Spring Creek Baptist Church in Benton, Arkansas. I've been there 12 years. I'm also, I've been a teacher at the Missionary Baptist Seminary here in Little Rock for 25 years.
And I've known Terry for a long time. He's a man of character. I won't go into his qualifications. I think as we get into the subject matter, you're going to find out he's more than qualified to talk about the separation of church and state. And Terry, with so much that goes on, and we've recently had our political contestants like a game show, but we've had those that were running for public office and had a list of questions. And one of the things I asked them was about when it comes to social issues and how they would handle that if elected. What was their philosophy and everything. We find that whenever we're dealing with government making of the laws, that sometimes the church and the state bump up against each other. We've had like the Ten Commandment, that was placed on the Capitol grounds. And so one of the discussions that happens in the hallway from time to time is about, is there such a thing as separation of church and state? Should there be such a thing as separation of church and state? So let me just ask you an open-ended question getting started. If you were to take a position, which side would you take and why would you take it? And give us some experience or give us some examples.
Yes, sir. I believe in complete separation of church and state, and here's why. Because the First Amendment to the Constitution tells us that the government shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, the First Amendment also continues on by talking about or abridging the freedom of speech or of press or the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Without freedom of religion, there's not going to be any freedom of speech either. Freedom is and separation of church and state is in two different areas. One is the government cannot make a law that establishes a religion. And the second one is that they want to protect and allow the free exercise thereof. That means simply that we're going to have to deal with people who disagree with us, but they still have a right to their religion and exercise thereof, and also a freedom from religion. If they don't want to have a religion, that's up to them, because if a forced faith is no faith at all. So our standards and morals all come from those types of things, and we believe that as a Christian, I believe that the Bible sets all of those things, and I want to follow those. But there are some people that don't believe the Bible, but they still have the same rights and privileges that I do, and I want to make sure that they have that.
So as far as the beginning of the concept or the idea or the history about, and I know you from what you just read, but as far as where the battleground began for the separation of church and state or for the crossing over the line to bring the church and state together as one, what's the history as far as where it really all began?
Well, it started with Constantine in the 300s when he declared Christianity legal, and the church and state came together, and they've been that way until the American Revolution. It was not until the state of Virginia passed its first religious liberty law, which was sponsored, by the way, by Thomas Jefferson, that we ever had any kind of religious liberty. Now, in the United States, in that amendment first of the Bill of Rights that I read, the First Amendment, a man by the name of John Leland was running for state legislature in the state of Virginia, and he stepped away so that James Madison could be elected. And he was good friends with Mr. Madison, and John Leland was a Baptist pastor, and he was the one who spent a great deal of time influencing Madison and James Monroe, both to later be presidents, to make sure that there was a First Amendment written like it's written so that the government would not be involved in church. And by that, I mean by paying the clergy, requiring people to go to church as they had done in the colonies. And the Baptists had always been and always had the idea of religious liberty and had advocated that throughout the Revolution. And then with the Constitutional Convention, Mr. Leland did his very best to make sure that it was part of our history.
So as a Christian, what's the balance between, for everybody knows I'm a senator, everybody knows I'm a Christian, I hope they do, not because I'm telling you, but because of the way you see me living, and I pastor a church. So what is the balance as far as what I hold as a personal view as a Christian and as a minister versus when it comes to the establishment of the laws to where I would infringe my rights over into what we would do as a state? How would you respond to that, or what would be your advice on that?
I go back to something that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson talked about in their letters to each other in the latter years of their life. You can find these documents in a book called The Founding Brothers. Now, one of the things that both of them believed in was a very strong morality, and that without good morals and a strong morality, that there could not be an efficient government, especially a Republican form of government that we now enjoy. Now, neither one of them, Mr. Adams was a Congregationalist. Mr. Jefferson was basically a deist. And because of what they believed in these things. And Jefferson even put together his own Bible, which if you ever find a copy of it, you'll find it quite interesting because of what he left out. Now, one of the things about your question is about our personal morality. Here's the interesting thing to me in separation of church and state. I can't and you can't go to the legislature and not be influenced by your morality. However, you can understand the difference between establishing a religion. You don't want to establish a religion. You want to establish moral principles. There are moral principles throughout all of society, from the Code of Hammurabi all the way to our own American law system. I don't want anybody to abandon what they believe, but I do want everybody to have a balanced view of the fact that somebody next to me might not believe exactly what I do. He has or she has the right to do that, to believe that, but there's where we find a compromise, which is, by the way, the art of a Republican form of government. If you look throughout our history, whether it's the Missouri Compromise in 1820 or just compromises over budgets in the last 40 years, you'll see that that art of compromise is a part of government. However, that does not mean that people are not voting their convictions or they're not voting and standing by what they believe. Sometimes, especially in legislative matters, there's a middle ground.
So do you think we can legislate our morality then?
Oh, we always legislate our morality, no matter whose it is. When someone passes a piece of legislation, that legislation contains someone's principles, someone's ideas and ideals of what they think is right and wrong. And therein lies the debate that we have to have. Now, one of the things that I think is missing in government and sometimes even in religion is a civility of debate that we need to go back to. Now, before we get the idea that everybody was always civil to one another, if you look at some of the cartoons that they drew of President Abraham Lincoln, you'll find that sometimes even in those things that we think are civil are not that civil.
Now, there's a history there. So, because that's one of the things that, you know, if you're a Christian and you're in service, as in you're an elected official, there is a component out there that feel that we should not have that right. We should not have that ability to separate where we are morally when it comes to the influence of the decisions that we make, especially on social issues. And that was one of the questions we asked the candidates that were in the last few weeks about how would you handle the social side of things as far as legislating laws that relate to society issues, go ahead.
I think you vote your convictions. Now, you may not have the majority when the vote's taken, but I would not ask anyone to compromise their own convictions, no matter what, in that type of situation.
And so your suggestion or your counsel as far as how we maintain, because I think that as a nation we are on a moral decline. I'm not so sure here in Arkansas. I think we still are somewhat insulated, although it is a constant battle to maintain that environment. But when you look across the board at the rest of the nation and some of the things that are happening in other states, especially involving sanctity of life and, some of the things that I would hope you and I agree upon that are of value to God, it would appear that the morality is on a decline. So all that being said, how do your ideas of morals, my ideas of morals may be two different things. And yet if we say you legislate your morality, you're actually legislating your views or your perspective as it relates to that particular social issue. Agree or disagree, or what do you think?
I would agree. I don't know how to make a decision without my moral compass and without my filters that are there. I don't know how any other legislator could do that as well. It's the same type of thing that a Christian doctor has to face. about what he or she believes about sanctity of life. That's the same thing that comes in there. My personal views on a lot of things, I can tell you how I voted on a lot of things, and it's not going to agree with what we're practicing in this state right now. But I'm willing to accept the rule of law that comes down because I believe in separation of church and state. Am I going to riot and throw a fit? No. Am I going to fuss with that myself? Probably, and things like that. So, my concept of what the Bible teaches is I believe in the inerrancy of Scripture. So I'm going to stick with that. However, if I'm in the legislature, and one of the things that I haven't done is I've always been a little bit of a political animal. I'd love to be in the legislature. They probably wouldn't love me in there, but I would, because I'm going to stick to what I believe. Now, if the vote's taken, one of the nice and interesting things about our government, if we understand it right, from a civics point of view, is when the vote's taken, you abide by the law.
Agreed.
Okay.
So when we, I wish everybody had that attitude, but anyway, but that's the give and take, because if you don't like the law, then gather enough support and come back the next time around and change the law, but don't go out and burn down buildings and flags and all that other mess. So let's just take 3 issues that have come before us as a legislative branch that we've had discussions on, or that we've actually made laws regarding, and give your thoughts and opinions based on everything you said leading up to. 10 Commandment Monument on the Capitol grounds.
The 10 Commandment Monument, if it's paid by outside sources and not government funds, I have no problems with that. There are other groups that want to put their monument up there. If they follow the same procedures and they have the same funding in the sense of its private funding, they have a right to have it up there as well. Because even in Arkansas, in the Arkansas Constitution, there is that section that talks about not establishing a religion. You don't want to establish anybody's religion.
So how would you respond to those that say the 10 Commandments being on the Capitol grounds is the establishment of a religion?
Not if it's paid for with private funds. If it's paid for with government funds, yes. Now, they say that's the government land. Well, if I remember Mr. Lincoln correctly, the government is the people. So it's ours. Anybody's and everybody's. So if one's there, the other can be there.
If they go through the same process
that
they went through with the 10 Commandments. What about In God We Trust? We passed a law regarding the placement of In God We Trust. Those are, I think, now nationwide, there's like 22,000 of them, in the public schools and throughout other institutions. Opinion about that?
Opinion about that? Well, let's put it this way. When I read In God We Trust, I'm thinking about the God of the Old and New Testament, the God of the Bible. If my opinion and memory serves me right about the world religions that are out there, they also call their deities God. Now, I may read that as the God of the Bible. I wonder what the others read it as when they read it. What God do they see? There's a whole different thing there in the sense that I understand that those who are opposed to that read that and say, this is strictly a Christian God. A whole lot of other people may read it and read a whole different thing. I don't think it hurts any more than having it up there than having it not there, because if you don't trust God, it doesn't mean anything to you.
And so if it said the God of Abraham, the forerunner of Christ, and took it a little bit deeper instead of leaving it
pretty
generic,
Christian.
that would be crossing the line in your opinion.
I would think so.
Okay. All right. And then the other one is teaching Bible classes in public school. That's a big push, to try to get Bible classes taught in school. What's your thoughts on that?
I noticed that we've had a couple of different states to pass that law. The interesting thing to me would be the simple fact that, number one, who's going to be your teacher? Will that teacher have a pre-understanding of Scripture, or will they teach it strictly as history? Teaching it strictly as history would be no different than teaching any other world religion as strictly as history. From a doctrinal point of view, as a Baptist, I don't want anybody else teaching my children about what the Bible says. That's my responsibility as a parent, my responsibility as a pastor. Am I going to protest if they have them, the schools teach it? No. Am I going to protest if they don't? No.
But if somebody was teaching it wrong, would you show up at your local school board meeting and express your thoughts, or show up at the superintendent's office?
Probably show up at the superintendent's office first and try to do it as quietly as possible before you make a stink.
Okay. Now, this is just this is a pastor-to-pastor kind of conversation, because, when I think about humanism and I look at the definition of humanism, you could go to some sources and they would say that humanism is actually a religion. And when you think of it in the terms of humanism and what they teach through humanism as being a religion, and you see how that has permeated, both our schools and our higher ed institution as well, I'm just curious as to whether or not what your thought about humanism. Do you see it as a religion? Do you see it just as a teaching, or what do you see it as? And should there be an effort to limit what is taught as far as falling under the guidelines of humanism, if indeed it is a religion? And would that cross the line of separation, church and state?
Humanism as such has been qualified throughout the last 75 years as being an advocated religion. Now, some people disagree with that, and that's fine. But one of the things that disturbs me as a pastor is the fact that Christian people have not stood up to this with their own children and in their own homes and in their own local school boards. And this is one of those things that, again, I think is the responsibility of the parent and the local church. I think we're supposed to be a little bit more salt and a little bit more light than we've been in the last several years, because we've been afraid to activate ourselves in the public arena, when the public arena needs us even more than we've ever been. I don't think we have to pass laws that force people to do things. I think we have to compete in the arena of ideas. And those ideas that I have and those ideas that I think you have about all of this are simply ideas that we can advocate, teach, live, and propagate. And I think we can do it effectively. But I think we've abandoned that to some degree because we've been afraid that somebody's going to sue us.
And we were talking before about the gentleman that was preaching from prison. Tell that story for a second, because then I want to lead into something with that.
All right. In 1776, a Baptist preacher by the name of John Waller was preaching in Virginia, and he was arrested for violating laws on assembly and speech because he was preaching Baptist doctrine. He started preaching out of his jail window. They built a wall in front of the window with about a 3-foot space in it so the air could continue to get in. And after his congregation saw the wall, they just simply lined up so that he could look out and they could still hear him, and he was going to continue to speak. And he continued to preach and advocate what he believed, even from the jail. And so I think he looked at that and said, okay, what I'm going to do is exercise my free right to speak, my free right to assemble, and my free right of separation of church and state, regardless of what the law says. Now, he was in jail. He was arrested. And in being in jail and being arrested, though, he was not creating violence of any kind. He was just simply advocating his position. I think we need that kind of same spirit of advocacy.
Very good. So when he was exercising his First Amendment right,
yes, sir,
to free speech, and this is pastor to pastor, and you guys can listen to his audience, it's been my position for a while that the church has neglected her responsibility, that if she would resume her responsibility to do more of what he did, to make that kind of commitment, that we could start to bend the curve back as far as, the humanism. I mean, it seems like every time we make a law, somebody finds an end around, and it ends up in court, and the judge will, if it's a contentious thing, it'll end up in court, and the court will end up deciding what the intent of that law was. But there is nothing that limits us as Christians from having that free speech. And maybe we would be put in a position one day that we might be in prison, like the Apostle Paul, the gentleman you mentioned, and that's going to come down to the level of conviction. And yes, I think that's part of what we wrestle with in the church world today is the level of conviction that people have, that they're willing to subject themselves either to the ridicule or the peer pressure, that no matter how many laws I make or any other legislator makes, that the reality is the law of responsibility rests with God's people to do their job.
Which has always been the position of those of us who have been Baptist, is that we want revival. It starts not in the state house, but in the church house.
We can pray for it, put some legs to it. Anything else you want to share for the moment?
No, sir.
Can you sit for a second?
Sure.
All right. So for those of you that have been listening, let me give you a shout out, first of all, to our sponsors. We're not doing the news break at the bottom of the hour. I pay for 55 minutes. I'm going to get all 55 minutes and not concede 5 minutes. You can watch that later. So Edwards Food Store, I want to say a shout out to them. Also to Baxley Penfield Mowdy, and also to Everett GMC Buick. These are all now Edwards Food Store throughout central Arkansas, over in the eastern part of Arkansas. Baxley Penfield Mowdy, Everett GMC, Central Arkansas, located there in Saline County, right off the I-30 corridor, and Duck's Garage down in Benton. And I also want to do a little housekeeping that the views expressed by the host and by the guest are ours and ours alone. We have that opportunity to do that, Terry, under the First Amendment right, and we are thankful that we have that opportunity. Want to give a shout out also that if you're looking for something to do next Saturday night that's free, you can come down to our Sportsman Supper. I pastor Saline Baptist Church down in the community of Tull. That's Tull. It's outside of Benton. We have the Game and Fish Director, Pat Fitz, who's going to come down and talk about all things game and fish, and they're going to bring some of their toys and trying to work on a few other things, but we do have a lot of things that are kid-friendly. We got a lot of free door prizes, too, so this is a free event for you to come. I do want to give a shout-out to my Methodist brethren. They are also having a sportsman supper at First Methodist Church in Benton. You can choose to go to that one if you want. I think it's $10, and I'd encourage you just to exercise your option to take advantage of either one of those. Guest this morning, or this afternoon, for the first part of the half hour has been Dr. Terry Parrish, who is the president of the American Baptist Association, also an instructor over at the Missionary Baptist Seminary over on Stagecoach Road, where I got some of my training, and going back a few years, even back to when it was on Asher and Roosevelt. I was there when the big flood came through. I don't know if you remember that one.
I do.
Big flood, when it flooded the car lot down there and everything. Also, he is pastor of Spring Creek Baptist Church. So if you're looking for a good church home, you can, first of all, come to mine. If you don't like mine, then you can go to Terry's and check Terry's out. But hang with us for a minute because we might get some questions, but I might think of another question if you can hang on. We're going to transition. We have Dr. Jennifer Dillaha. Am I pronouncing that right?
That is correct.
Very good. If you will, a little closer to the mic then. Ben, this is Dr. Jennifer Dillaha. For those of you that are watching on Facebook Live, she is with the Department of Health. And we've actually had the opportunity to sit beside each other at an award ceremony where we both received an award. And I think it was dealing with the PBM and with the opioid. And what else was it? That's been a year ago.
The award that the Arkansas Pharmacists Association gave me was for a non-medical or non-pharmacist award, Friend of Pharmacy.
Yep. That was a great night for us to be together, and that's the first time we got to meet.
Yes.
So the big topic of the day, the coronavirus, and it's been flipping up on the Fox News, and it seems like it's spreading down the West Coast and down the East Coast, and then it looks like it's almost following the path of the Mississippi River, right from New Orleans straight on up. But so far, we haven't made the map that's turned Arkansas red. One of the things I wanted to do by having you on the show today is there's a lot of speculation out there, a lot of rumors, and just I think partly a lot of misinformation that's going on. So can you tell us, as far as where we are right now in the state of Arkansas, how are we being impacted, or do we have anybody active that has an active case of the coronavirus right now?
Right now, we have no confirmed cases of COVID-19 is what they call the disease that the virus causes. We don't have any confirmed cases in Arkansas. We are following very closely about 100 different travelers who have come to the state from being in countries where the virus is spreading, and they're staying home for 2 weeks and We check with them every day. They're monitoring their temperatures and reporting any symptoms they have. We've tested about 6 people, I think, and all of them have been negative. Soon we will have more testing available throughout the state through some of the main lab companies, and so that'll give people, I think, better peace of mind about having access to tests and whether or not they should be tested, and we can sort through cases because sometimes it's hard to tell. The COVID-19 has very similar symptoms to influenza, and right now we are having a lot of influenza in Arkansas.
I went to the Heart Hospital to see a couple church members yesterday, and I haven't been in any of their hospitals. I don't know what they're doing, but just happened to be there. And I know that before I could get in the hospital, they asked me, 3, 4 standard questions. Have you been with anybody who's been sick? Have you traveled outside the country? And they took my temperature, and, then they slapped a badge on me to say I was clean, I guess. I always think about that statement, you're unclean. But anyway, I was clean and was allowed to get in. So is that a general practice now when it comes to how do we test people and know for certainty, given the massiveness of what we're talking about, what are the best tests, and how do you know for a fact that people do not have it?
Well, right now, our public health response is to contain the spread of the virus. So we're testing the people who are at greatest risk and who have symptoms. We're not testing it for people who don't have symptoms. But eventually, we will have spread of this virus in Arkansas. It spreads like the flu, and we can't keep the flu out of Arkansas. It's unlikely we will be able to keep this new virus out of Arkansas. So then, in that case, we would switch to a strategy of lessening or slowing the spread. And in that case, we may not want everyone tested, just the sickest people.
Okay. And so how do you, when, we got the Little Rock National Airport and everything, how do we make sure that the people that are coming in from those trips, you said you're monitoring 100, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't want to call out any one particular school to cause panic, but I know there were some students that came in through a school and they kind of self-quarantined themselves, is what I've heard, just kind of voluntarily. So how does the Department of Health track people that are coming in from out-of-country visits? And if they are traveling from out-of-country back here to Arkansas, at what point do you interact with them to make sure that they're not a carrier of the virus?
So travelers that come from China and Iran, we're notified by the CDC that someone is arriving, and then we contact them and we give them instructions about self-quarantining at home. The schools, there were more than one school in Arkansas that brought home students who were studying abroad in Italy. They contacted us and provided us with contact information for their students. We contacted them, and they are self-quarantining, or some people call it self-isolating themselves. We're in contact with them, and we track their how they're doing, whether they have questions or needs, give them instructions about what to do to stay safe and keep from exposing other people to the virus in case they develop illness.
So as far as the actual treatment of it, you heard, Israel is supposed to be on the cutting edge. I know that, the federal government just appropriated a huge amount of money to go toward that, which I'm kind of curious. Can you give us any insight? So they're throwing money at this thing, but what is that money intended to do, and how is it intended to actually slow it down or to stop it? Do you know what that money is going to be used for?
Well, some of the money will be used to support state and local health departments to do the work that they need to do, because it's taking extra manpower as well as additional efforts and time. And it's also supporting the systems that they need, the electronic systems and the development of tests and the studies to do what works to treat this illness. Right now, we do not have a approved treatment for this disease. Funding is also being made available to develop vaccines, and there's 3 or 4 companies, maybe more, who are working on a vaccine. But takes time because they have to do the safety studies and make sure that the vaccine actually works. So that will take a long time, and those are very expensive studies to do. And then, of course, there's concerns about healthcare personnel having the protective equipment they need, the masks and the gowns and eye shields and so forth. And so some funding will go to that. Those are some things I'm aware of. I'm not up on what all that money will be going to, but those are some of the things I'm aware of.
Okay. And so you hit on something there, because one of the things they've, talked about is, we've heard it said about the run that's on, like the hand sanitizers, the gloves, the mask, and how it's kind of putting a strain on the resources. Do the masks actually do any good to prevent the virus, or is that, what preventive measures can people take that really work in order to keep from getting the virus?
Well, the mask is really most beneficial to people who are sick, because this virus is spread by what we call respiratory droplets, little droplets that people sneeze out or cough out that have the virus in it. And then if they get in your face, in your mouth, nose, eyes, then you can catch the disease. But for people who are not ill, the mask is not all that helpful. The most helpful thing for people to do is get in the habit of washing their hands thoroughly and doing it often. And if hand washing is not readily available, then use hand sanitizers. And there are other things that people can do, and we usually call them social distancing. So people don't shake hands. Instead, they do a fist bump or bump their elbows or do a little bow, something in place of shaking hands, which is a hard habit to break. And then there are other things that we should do, but it's hard for many people to do, and that's stay home from work when we're sick, and kids stay home from school when they're sick.
I pastor a church, and I tell our members, if you're sick, you have a free pass. The pastor will not berate you if you show up sick or bring your kids to the nursery and put them in the nursery with the other kids. And my wife is a public school teacher, and teachers will tell you, too, if your kids are sick, keep them home, because all it does is just, it just spread. So the preventive measures are just pretty much along the lines of any common sense approach to dealing with anything, including the flu or others.
Yes, it's spread very much the same way. The same types of measures would be very beneficial. In fact, I wish we would do it more for the flu. So
just for a moment, let's kind of sidebar, and then we'll finish up with discussion on that. Let me ask you, what are the signs and the symptoms of I'm just stuck on calling it the coronavirus. So what are the signs and symptoms when somebody gets that? How long does it run its course of action? And how is it that it leads to a person's death?
All right. So when a person is exposed, it generally takes 5 days or so to develop symptoms, but it can take up to 14 days, which is why we ask for 14 days quarantine if someone's been exposed. If they develop symptoms, then they're likely to have fever, cough, and shortness of breath or some difficulty breathing. It causes a pneumonia. And the people who are most likely to have severe pneumonia are older people and people who have underlying health conditions. And that pneumonia can be very severe, and it can lead to death. Most people who get this illness have mild illness, over 80%. They may have no pneumonia or very mild pneumonia. Some people will have some pneumonia that requires some supplemental oxygen, but it's the group that moves on into the critical phase where those people will need perhaps mechanical ventilation, which means being put on a breathing machine. They may experience respiratory failure as well as multi-organ dysfunction, and about half of those people would likely die.
So are we at the pandemic level yet, or at what point does it get to that point? Because that's kind of the misinformation. I've kind of been watching the Fox 16 screen above about, the points of misinformation. What are some of the points of misinformation that are being given, and what's the counter to it to neutralize those things?
Well, I think we will eventually meet the criteria for pandemic.
Which is what?
Well, basically, a pandemic is a global epidemic. and it's still spreading. So as it spreads more than at some point it will be, the World Health Organization may declare that it's a pandemic. But for us in the U.S., we will have likely widespread illnesses as a result of this virus because it's so contagious. It's not as deadly as some of the other coronaviruses, such as SARS or MERS, but those viruses were not as contagious. So we may have more deaths, but the death rate may not be as high. So some of the misinformation out there, I purposely have tried to stay away from it because I think by repeating it, then it reinforces it.
I got a very smart listening audience, so they can differentiate the difference, but go ahead.
Well, some of the things that you may hear are just remedies that don't really work, but people would like to sell them to you so that you can help them with their business. And right now, there are no proven treatments for the for COVID-19. So save your money and use it for something else. Other things are that there are certain people who are more likely to have this disease than others. And it happened that it first arose in China, but people who are of Asian descent are not more likely to have this or to catch the disease than anyone else in the community in the U.S. So we can put that aside. And then people are very worried about children with this disease. And so children may very well spread it, but I'm happy to say that children do very well with this disease. The last report that I saw said there hadn't been any reported deaths in children under 9. So I think that's a hopeful thing to us. And you may be aware of other myths that I'm not. So if you are, I'll be happy to try to address them.
I had a friend yesterday I was talking to that is, I think he was going to one of the major cities out on the West Coast, and they have a Chinatown. Mm-hmm. And he was talking about how they were going to avoid that at all costs because it's Chinatown, just some of the stigma associated with the, with the word China. So, the virus is not a respecter of person that would go and hit like Chinatown or in any other designated area. And I think that's, one of the unfortunate myths that I've heard is that, that if you have that descent, that you're automatically going to be a carrier of it. And that's a misnomer and misstatement out there as well. Is that true?
Yes. I mean, so, it's really, Italy's really having a hard time right now. And I don't think people would think Italians would be at greater risk any more than the Chinese.
So how prepared are we as a state to respond, and what goes into being prepared so that if we do get that first case, how will that be handled, and how are the hospitals set up? I know that was one thing I was watching on some of the news reports and everything, that hospitals have, certain hospitals may be more prepared than others to handle this because of maybe the quarantine area that they have. So talk us through it, that if that first case occurs here in Arkansas, how does that play out, and take us through the process?
Okay, so this illness is very much like a severe case of influenza, and any hospital should be able to handle that as long as they have the facilities for intensive care. And we have been preparing for pandemic influenza over the years. The Arkansas Department of Health, as well as many other sister agencies, have worked together to develop a pandemic influenza plan. And because this illness is much like pandemic influenza, it's different in that there is no vaccine or known treatment at this point, but there's enough similarity that we're able to adapt that plan and work together. So we've been working to make sure that hospitals know and to screen people when they come in, especially in the emergency departments. We're trying to encourage people to call ahead if they're going to the emergency department, so that they can have a mask on before they enter, and that the people in the emergency departments or clinics that are seeing these patients are prepared with the proper protective equipment. They need gowns, gloves, special masks for healthcare providers called N95s, and protection for their eyes, so that when they assess these patients, they're not putting themselves at risk, and that they can take care of these patients in a way that does not endanger other patients.
I saw on the news in some of the hospitals, I mean, it looks like a hazmat scene for those that are dealing with the individuals, and they've got their full outfits on, their protective gear. So are all the hospitals equipped up to that level, or is that really required? Or will, when and if we get the first case, are there designated hospitals that those individuals are going to be sent to? Because I think about the rural hospitals, and do they really have the manpower and the resources to deal with it? Or because you said the protocol for the emphysema is already in place, are the hospitals equipped to receive people no matter what part of the state they're in?
Yeah. So if a hospital has an intensive care unit, then, and this person has severe disease, then they would be equipped to handle them. And there would not be a reason to transfer them to another hospital. A lot of these patients get diagnosed and have mild disease and can go home. They may not need hospitalization. So they would be isolated at home with the proper protocols. Now, one of the concerns, though, if we have very widespread in COVID-19 in Arkansas, will our healthcare system be strained by that, by the number of patients? And that remains to be seen. But all hospitals have plans for what to do. And it happened a couple of years ago to many hospitals, not so much in Arkansas, but in many other states, where they had to set up tents outside their hospital in their parking lots to take care of patients because their hospitals were full. So hospitals have plans in place for how to handle this kind of surge of patients.
One thing I'm curious about is, let's say that there is that first case diagnosed here in Arkansas, which I'm glad to hear there's not one yet, but let's say it happens. What about, how do you go back tracing where that person has been, who that person has been in contact with, and what limitations are placed on those that person has been in contact with?
So whenever a person is identified as even a suspect of having COVID-19 that would require testing, then all of their close contacts are identified and tracked. So that would be people who in their household or spent time within 6 feet of them, because that's about as far as the droplets will travel. And they are tracked, and they go into quarantine. And that is how we will work to keep the virus from spreading. It may get to a point where it's widespread enough in the community that people won't know how they got their infection. That has happened already in other states, particularly in Washington state. And in that case, then everyone needs to take steps to protect themselves. And same kind of steps we've talked about already is social distancing. If it becomes widespread in the communities, business leaders need to have plans for what to do with their employees to encourage them not to come to work sick. They need to have liberal policies. And then also, as much as possible, for there to be telecommuting or teleworking, if at all possible. People can work from home. And then schools will have to make decisions about whether they stay in session or they let students study at home, and if they can have some teleeducation or assignments that will allow students to keep learning but not attend school.
And fortunately, here in Arkansas, we have, it was called snow days, and the bill was originally passed to allow suspend because of snow days or whatever, that students could work at home. So we've got that in place, which would be a good thing to exercise if that should happen. Do you find in other parts of the nation where this has become prominent that people are a little bit reluctant to identify that they have it because it would impact everybody around them and they themselves might have to be quarantined? Or is it one of those deals that the person gets so sick that they don't care at that point, and then they're willing to identify who all they've been around?
Well, we have found that people, for the most part, are very cooperative. Everybody wants to help the situation and prevent the spread. And it's the right thing to do. So we will hope that people will be willing to share who they've been around. Now, sometimes they don't, and it's not because they are ashamed of the disease. It's because they don't want people to know where they've been or who they've been with. So that can be a problem. But for the most part, people are quite willing to do what they can to protect themselves, their families, their neighbors, their community.
So when they find the vaccine to treat this, will it be like the flu shot that we're accustomed to getting every year in the fall, that moving forward we would get the COVID-19 shot to prevent it from happening? Or once this gets under control and the cycle is broke, we won't have to deal with it that way in the future?
Well, that remains to be seen. We know that, there's other coronaviruses that circulate all the time. They frequent cause of the common cold. And we know that humans do not develop lasting immunity to those viruses. So it's possible that humans would not develop lasting immunity to the virus that causes COVID-19. And so it remains to be seen if they can develop a vaccine that would develop protective immunity that would last for a long time. We won't know until the studies are done, but we hope that would be the case.
All right. One thing I would hope that wouldn't happen is that, because this has had such a significant impact around the world, that when they do find the vaccine, that it becomes very pricey and somebody would captivate, because of the need. But that's probably something you don't need to respond to, being a employee of the state.
Well, let me add one thing, though. There's several companies working on a vaccine, so there'll be some competition, I think.
Which will be good. Competition is always good. Real quickly, with the time we have left, which is about 2 minutes, where are we as far as the flu in Arkansas? It seems like has it been an above average year for the flu outbreak, or where are we in comparison to other times?
This has been a hard flu year, particularly for children. We have had our second pediatric death in Arkansas. It's been milder in terms of the number of hospitalizations, as well as the ER visits have been up, but the hospitalizations have been down. And I think it's because the types of flu that are circulating. So we still have widespread flu. It's not too late to get your flu vaccine, because I think we'll have it for some weeks more.
And I think that's one thing people may not realize. They think that you got to get it in September. Like, I work for a hospital. We get ours mandatory in September, October. People think that, well, if you don't get it then, you don't need to get it. But actually, as long as the flu is around, it's a good thing to get the flu shot if you haven't had it.
Indeed.
Okay. So last thing I want to say on the COVID-19 is, in Arkansas, we have no confirmed cases right now.
Correct.
And the Department of Health is set up to respond to that when it happens.
Yes.
And we have hospitals that are in place that are trained to deal with it.
Correct.
And just exercise good common sense as far as, the social contact that you were talking about, just the washing of the hands, and that'll be people's part that they can do. So as far as people running through the streets screaming and all that kind of panic kind of stuff, there's no reason for that to exist.
It's never a good time to panic. It doesn't help anyone.
All right. Thank you very much. We've had on the show today Dr. Jennifer Dillaha, who is associated with the Departments of Health here in Arkansas. Thank you for the factual information about the COVID-19 virus. May get you back on as this thing rocks along and just get some more accurate information from you.
I'd be happy to come back.
Very good. Also, earlier today, we had Dr. Terry Parrish, who is the president of the American Baptist Association, pastor of Spring Creek Baptist Church down, talking about the separation of church and state. If you enjoyed what you heard today, make sure to tell your friends so they can go back and pick it up. And good news, I reviewed the Facebook page, or the Facebook page, and also the website page this week. We should be getting that up in the next 10 days. We're tweaking it out. Want to make sure it's right. You've been listening to the Kim Hammer Show here on 101.1 FM, The Answer. Thank you for joining me today. Remember, a week from this Saturday, if you're watching Facebook Live, you can zoom in on the screen over here and pick up information about the sportsman banquet that we're having down at the church I pastor in Tull. Thank you for listening, and look forward to having you back with us next week. You've been listening to the Kim Hammer Show.
101.1 FM, The Answer. KDXE FM, Kamak Village, Little Rock. A Salem Media Group station. 101.1 FM, The Answer.